Yes.
All right. All right. Well, I guess I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Joe O'Brien. I'm a U.S. Forest Service research ecologist, and I just got assigned to be project leader of the Athens, Georgia Fire Lab, which we're also christening simultaneously. So it's a brand new facility in Athens. I'll tell you more about that later and why it might be of interest to you. My background and why I'm a Pine Rockland devotee is that my first professional job was in South Florida, working for Mike Ross as his technician down in the Florida Keys. And I stuck around for a master's with Suzanne Copter, working on a project with Jim Snyder in the Everglades on fire. So that was my first sort of exposure to, I wouldn't say first, Mike and I worked on fire in the Keys, but I started studying fire under Suzanne in the early 90s, working on the lovely milk pea and the deltoid spurge, two of my favorite plants in the whole world. And we were looking at a project on the impact of Hurricane Andrew on fire dynamics. And that project actually has been a sort of intellectual inspiration for me throughout my whole career. So I want to give a shout out to my mentors, Mike, Suzanne, Jim. And I went on to get a PhD with Steve Oberbauer in Costa Rica, a non sort of fire project, but a heavy instrumentation project, which also had a huge influence on sort of how my career unfolded. Since this is supposed to be kind of a retrospective, but focus on the future kind of Pine Rockland working group, that's my background. There I am standing in Lossman's Pines studying fire. So obviously fire in South Florida can be a little bit unusual. I like to point that out to my Western colleagues. You know, when you can see the Everglades burning sawgrass over water, they scratch their heads. So I work for the U.S. Forest Service. U.S. Forest Service is the sort of primary land management agency in the United States. So we manage the national forests and grasslands, but we also have an influence on nearly all forest management in the United States through the way our agency is sort of designed. So there are three primary, what do we call them, divisions within the Forest Service. There's a National Forest System, which is the actual land base of the Forest Service, 193 million acres. What's that, about 90 some million hectares for our Bahamian and Turks and Caicos friends. So the National Forest System is the actual operational arm of the Forest Service. And unlike all the other R&D or land management agencies in the U.S., we actually have a cadre of scientists whose job it is to help the managers manage using the most current and best appropriate science. So we have an R&D branch, and that's who I work for. I'm one of several hundred scientists. We're actually the largest natural resource management science agency in the world. We also have a division that might be of interest to you in South Florida that might be worth reaching out to, state and private forestry. And they're kind of like a national cooperative extension where they offer assistance for forest management across the country, specifically state and private forest landholders. So someday you might want to reach out to them and see if they got any money to help you get your management done. So in terms of what I said I was going to talk about, we're going to talk about sort of this transition and how we see fire from in relatively recent history. The Forest Service was instituted in 1905. Teddy Roosevelt here and Gifford Pinchot were the architects of the Forest Service. This is John Muir, architect of the National Park Service. So the agency began relatively early in the 20th century when attitudes about fire were shaped by sort of a European perspective. And we can dig deeper or not into that, but regardless, fire back then was seen as the enemy of forests. And in fact, one of the primary motivations for the formation of the Forest Service was a series of really large catastrophic fires that occurred in the late 1800s. One of them was in Wisconsin called the Great Peshtigo Fire that killed 8,000 people and burned up 20 million acres. So sort of the massive land clearing activities that was occurring in the late 1800s, early 20th century provided a lot of sort of novel fuels slash and fires coinciding with droughts caused an immense alarm among the population, enough so that both the formation of the Forest Service and the establishment of public forest lands was initiated. Now, stepping back, regardless of how the Forest Service saw fire when it was formed, I'm going to tell you, and I've told you this. It's like Chris Berg sent me a note. Sorry, I can't make your talk, but I've already drunk the Kool-Aid. I've given a couple of talks to the Pine Rockland Working Group where I discuss fire as an ecological imperative, and believe me, it is. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this element, but the fascinating thing is every year there's new and interesting paleo data on how important fire has been for the evolution of terrestrial life. We're all botanically inclined, or many of us are botanically inclined because of our interest in the Pine Rocklands, and it's pretty clear that some of the work coming out is showing that fire actually may have been responsible for the angiosperm explosion that occurred in the Cretaceous, which gives us all of our cool plants like the milk pea and the deltoid spurge. And even the pines and gymnosperms clearly evolved in the presence of fire. So this appreciation of fire as a critical ecological force is gaining traction in the scientific literature, but still fire is promoted or seen or perceived as catastrophic and destructive. It's still even called a disturbance. I'm starting to lead a campaign to call it a process. It's not really a disturbance. You can't call winter a disturbance. It does, it has impacts on vegetation, but you don't call something that repeats and is just sort of a integral part of a system a disturbance. A disturbance implies a perturbation. And in fire, the lack of fire is a bigger ecological perturbation than the fire itself in systems that are dependent on it. So fire, the ecological imperative. And so for the history of life on Earth until the Pleistocene, fires were lightning ignited, but we're pushing back the date at which humans or hominins started using fire. Matter of fact, I've been working with an anthropologist here archaeologist here at UGA, University of Georgia, who's pushed back the human-controlled use of fire to 1.7 million years. So this whole dichotomy between natural and human ignitions is to me, it's a I don't want to put it nicely, but it's a fallacy. So humans and fire, they became what I'm calling a biotic ignition source. So prior to that, there were abiotic ignitions from lightning and meteors and volcanoes, but in the Pleistocene, our hominin ancestors evolved the ability to first control fire and then start fire. And this is a game changer. And it has been a game changer throughout the world, and it currently continues to be a game changer in the world. And we know that indigenous peoples use fire to manipulate entire landscapes from the archaeological record, but also currently. This is a aerial photo of an area I worked in Honduras in La Mosquitia. And you can see evidence of prior fires, really fascinating patterns of fires structuring the landscape. And you can see two new ignitions that occurred when this Google satellite photo was taken. So we know that humans, wherever they were, had been structuring vegetation. So moving away from this idea that there's a dichotomy between a human ignited fire and a naturally ignited fire is something that we need to do, and it doesn't make sense ecologically to create that dichotomy. So back to the historical perspective. So the Forest Service sort of led the era of fire suppression. There was a big series of fires in 1910 called the Big Blow Up. There's some good PBS specials on it. We are experiencing a big wildfire season out west this year. A lot of us have had to go out west on suppression details. So fire suppression is still a major element of the Forest Service activity. Matter of fact, it dominates our activities. But it began in 1910 with the great big blow up. A bunch of firefighters were killed. 20 some million acres burned up in Montana, Idaho, and Utah. And what was established was this thing called the 10 a.m. rule. All fires had to be, as soon as a wildland fire was detected, it had to be suppressed by 10 a.m. that day. If you can't do it 10 a.m. today, you'll do it by 10 a.m. tomorrow. If you can't do it by 10 a.m. tomorrow, you better do it by 10 a.m. the next day. So that was the sort of operating policy of the Forest Service until very recently. Simultaneous to this concept of the 10 a.m. rule and suppress all wildfires, like, there's a lot of reasons why we developed it. There was this campaign in sort of our neck of the woods to suppress woods burning. Woods burning was prevalent in the Southeast up until about the early 1920s. It was a seamless transition from the Native Americans who were living in the landscape to the early settlers. They used fire in a very similar manner to structure the vegetation. Managed longleaf pine is the most famous example, and a lot of this work on the Dixie Crusaders that I'm poaching here comes from the Longleaf Alliance. Longleaf requires fire about every other year for it to sort of thrive, and it used to cover the majority of the southeastern coastal plain. It would never have covered that much ground if it weren't for people. Let's get that straight. And what happened was this idea that fire is destructive, it's an element of the devil. There was a religious element to this, and these proselytizers moved around the South telling people how evil it was to set fire to the woods. Now we know that longleaf pine cannot exist without fire, so it was kind of a catastrophic yet very effective campaign. So this idea that fire was bad was prevalent across disciplines. I got to move everybody here. I don't know if I can do that. Sorry. Even Aldo Leopold, who eventually came around to embrace fire as a useful management tool and actually died while conducting a prescribed fire. He had a heart attack and died while burning his property in Wisconsin. He, even after his conversations with Stoddard and some other proponents of fire, he said the use of fire without sound evidence is to be deplored. Now, clearly there's this implicit bias against fire that had seeped its way into researchers. Aldo Leopold was one of the first Forest Service scientists. He's got a long and storied history with the Forest Service research branch. Well, we operated under the principle that fire is bad, even though some of our pioneers in fire ecology in the Southeast and some in California actually were starting to raise the alarm that we shouldn't be suppressing all fire. Some fire is good. There's this timeline, and we can see some critical sort of events that occurred that really allowed us to be pretty effective at suppression. The 10 a.m. policy worked. It was an aggressive approach to fire suppression. 1940, the smoke jumpers were deployed that could allow fires to be suppressed quickly in remote areas. So now we're starting to send people in areas where you can't get to very easily by road. So they're able to put fires out quickly in remote areas. Public relations campaign, Smokey Bear. It's often studied as the most effective advertising campaign in modern history. Name recognition for Smokey, it may be declining with changes in how media is approached, but at its height, name recognition for Smokey was about 90% among the American population. It's who doesn't know who Smokey is? But then things started changing. 1964, when the Wilderness Act was signed, part of the language said that if lightning ignited a fire, and it goes back to this dichotomy between humans and lightning, it should be allowed to burn in a wilderness. That still doesn't happen, but it was the intent of the Wilderness Act. 1978 was really when total suppression was being questioned in the Forest Service. Now, I'm going to say that the Everglades and some of the people in South Florida were way ahead of the curve on the idea of fire as a useful management tool. But the real game changer was the 1988 Yellowstone fires, if you remember those. That was when people really began to question, well, these forests that are supposed to burn, they're not burning. What are we doing to our national forests? Then some other legislative things happened that mandated sort of undoing the damage of 100 years of fire suppression. So we have this sort of timeline. And if we go back to what started people thinking about fire as a useful tool, we have to really give homage to Herbert Stoddard, who was a scientist who worked on quail up at Tall Timbers area, sort of South Georgia, North Florida. He clearly recognizes, any good ecologist would, or game manager would, that taking fire out of a longleaf pine system is a catastrophe. And so he began lobbying, and he was an outcast for lobbying for the controlled application of fire. And he's got some interesting takes on how sort of his former adversaries adopted controlled burning, but then called it prescribed burning because they felt like they had to sort of take it out of the hands of the individual and make it a professional tool. And we could talk about that and the pros and cons of that if we want to. But Herbert Stoddard was really the father of modern fire ecology and sort of one of the pivotal moments in our concept of fire as a tool. Now, that said, Dr. Bill Robertson, who I am so fortunate to have had an opportunity to meet and work with, and there's Mike Ross standing up there. I think he's drinking a beer. Dr. Bill recognized how critical fire was for the Everglades back in the 1950s. And so he was really a pioneer as well. He's an unsung hero. He's not given the recognition that I think he deserves outside of the region. And I've been kind of promoting Dr. Bill for every time I speak, and bragging about how the Southeast is where we really began to understand how to use fire and why fire is so important. So now we're in this era of fire management, but we're still kind of geared towards suppression. And once again, Everglades doesn't get credit, but as far as I can tell, they had the first officially sanctioned prescribed fire by a federal agency. So we're in this era of fire management where we're still not even coming close to applying prescribed fire at the rate and coverage that we need to. So this is, don't worry about the words. This just came out a couple of weeks ago. This is a Senate bill that has been introduced called the National Prescribed Fire Act of 2020. And we'll come back to why this might be important to you. If it ever passes, it probably won't pass, but at least it's starting to get some traction. Some of the messages that we've been promoting are getting out there to the nation. And this could be a game changer if it were to be embraced by the House and passed by whoever's president. This could really be a game changer in our way and our switching from a suppression mentality to a prescribed fire application mentality. So Smokey started out, with this very clear and marketable message: only you can prevent forest fires, which is really not fair to put all the blame on you. But it was a simple message. It caught on. It was easy to remember. It's now been slightly tweaked. Nobody really even notices, but it's now only you can prevent wildfires. So that's still a good idea. We want to prevent wildfires, but the implicit change in the message is that not all fire is bad. Some fire is good. There's actually a Smokey Bear Good Fire, Bad Fire campaign that, it's 10,000 words. Nobody's ever going to read it. I think we need to somehow come up with a better way of getting out this idea that not all fire is bad. Not every fire is a catastrophe. So one attempt by the Longleaf Alliance is to introduce a competing character. This is Burner Bob, which has a lot of other implications, but Bob is a bobwhite quail wearing Nomex. And his job is to show people that fire is good. So we have good fire being promoted by Burner Bob. Go Burner Bob. Now, Burner Bob and Smokey are friends. I want everybody to understand that. So some of the Burner Bob advocates are they've been trying to set up like a wrestling match, but I'm like, no, they're friends. They should be friends. So bringing it around to sort of home, I've heard tell in conversations with folks in South Florida why they're not burning. They're saying, oh, people are hostile to burning. Well, the reality is people aren't. Some pretty good social science has shown that between 80 and 90% of the American population approves of prescribed fire as an appropriate management tool. They have some caveats and who applies it and how it's applied, but it's the people understand it more than you think. There's sort of this perception among the fire management community that I interact with that, oh, the people hate fire. Like, no, they don't. They actually don't. There's some laws that require it. The Endangered Species Act in management plans and recovery documents, if fire is listed as a critical process that will maintain habitat, it's actually required. So there's laws that support it. There's laws that protect people who apply it, liability laws, and fundamentally, it's the best management practice for there is no surrogate for fire. So I'm going to quick jump into the second part of my talk here, which is milestones. I was trying to loosely follow the template that Jennifer sent, and a retrospect on my career and where I'm at right now. I think there's two milestones. One that happened about 10 years ago. So this concept of the ecology of fuels. And now we're in the middle of sort of a major milestone in this concept of prescribed fire science, which I think you'll find interesting. I've talked about the ecology of fuels to this group before, but basically what it is there's this interaction between forest structure, the fuels that are produced by that forest structure, and fire. And so you can think about how fire functions in a landscape through the lens of fuels. And what I mean by fuels is basically vegetation, whether living or dead. And so this is a way of framing how managing the forest structure will influence fire behavior, which then will subsequently influence fire effects, which will feed back into vegetation structure. So it's a conceptual framework that is really useful. I'm not going to say much more about that because I've talked about it in the past. We can talk, and some of the disruptions in the pine canopy that occurred in the Keys, that occurred in Miami after Hurricane Andrew, that occurred in Turks and Caicos because of the tortoise, the little insect. Those were catastrophic, not only because the loss of the trees themselves, but because of their influence on the fuels. If you don't have fuel, you can't have a fire. If you don't have fire, you lose fire-dependent plants and animals. So prescribed fire science, what is it, why we need it, how we do it? I just gave this pitch to my station. We just finished construction right in time for COVID of a open combustion laboratory at my office. We're able to set fires, about 20 by 20 foot surface fires, whatever kind of fires in this room, control all the conditions, and start to really get at mechanisms that are important for understanding how fire works. And why do we need to do that? Well, once again, fire is the ecological imperative. It's happening all over the planet. It affects every single type of vegetation on the planet, either frequently or infrequently. It's an essential process. It's not a catastrophe. Yet, the state of knowledge in wildland fire is severely deficient. We have a very poor understanding of how the fire itself functions and how fire effects are mediated and how to manage it. So, as you know from the California fire situation, prescribed fire is being touted as, and it's rightfully so touted as, a way of mitigating catastrophic fuel loads and wildfires. But there's been hardly any investigations that really look into how to go about doing that. And those who depend on fire to manage their forests are left kind of in the dark, trial by fire, so to speak. So the users of fire need better information. So that was our motivation. Now, this is something I want everybody to consider becoming a part of. And it's been kind of the train has gone off the track with COVID, but we just started this thing, myself and a couple of other people formed a consortium of fire scientists and fire managers called the Prescribed Fire Science Consortium. It's headquartered between Tall Timbers and Athens, but we have these annual burn events where we get scientists and managers together to participate in prescribed fires that are being measured for research, but then there's this direct one-on-one exchange of information that can't happen any other way. When I didn't make this slide, but they clearly went on the internet and found a really old photo of me because I don't look nearly as good looking as that anymore. So, but the Prescribed Fire Science Consortium is motivated by that lack of knowledge on prescribed fire and the recognition of the critical role that prescribed fire is going to play. Most of the money and most of the research effort is gone for wildfires, like 10-1, more or less. And wildfires, you're not going to get very far studying wildfires if you're interested in fire as a biophysical process, because it's hard to measure a wildfire. It's hard to get pre-fire data, and it's just not that useful for improving fire management of systems that depend on frequent fire, especially. So we recognize that. If we look at just the definitions, there's fundamental differences in intent of how wildfires are managed versus prescribed fires. Wildfires are unplanned ignitions where the intent is to extinguish the fire. This is defined by law. Prescribed fires are defined as fires ignited to achieve land management objectives. So one is somebody else lit it or something else lit it, we're going to put it out. The other one is we got a landscape that's not on fire, we're going to apply fire because we want that fire to do something. Big differences in intent. So the science, which is designed to inform the intent, needs to be fundamentally different. Don't worry about this. This is just a reiteration. Safety of human life and property and natural resource values are the primary goal of wildfire-centric science. Alternatively, the goal of those of us employed in prescribed fire science, we want to help people meet objectives without causing a wildfire. The realm of fire differs between the two as well. Most prescribed fires occur under kind of mild conditions. If you think about this as sort of a drought axis, and this is the number of acres burned, 95% of your prescribed fires occur under very sort of moist conditions that mitigate fire intensity. Alternatively, wildfires, especially big ones, typically occur at this end of the droughty, dry spectrum. Dry fuels burn really well, oftentimes combined with high winds. You get this kind of binomial distribution of acres burned. Fire managers are more interested in how ignition pattern affects their fire behavior, which will affect fire effects. They're also interested in how to deal with smoke. And once again, since management is the objective, not safety, we're interested in the ecological effects of the fire. So I'm setting up why we propose that there needs to be a new kind of science. If you think about the realm of wildland fire from the perspective of fuel consumption and fuel moisture. So when you're down at this end of the spectrum, your grasses are so wet that they won't burn. You can't get them to burn. That's called the moisture of extinction. Different fuels have different moistures of extinction. This is just a hypothetical graph. They're not based on any real numbers, but what we see is that because of our sort of top-down approach to prescribed fire, and because prescribed fires need to be contained, we work in this realm. So, you know, you're talking about your fine fuels will be consumed, maybe if a little bit if you're towards the edge of your prescription window, that you get some woody fuels consumed. These are like sticks, branches, and logs. You know, this is jargon. This is fire jargon for fuels. So you have, 10-hour fuels take 10 hours to come into equilibrium with the atmosphere. So, twigs the size of your pinky, size of your arm, size of your leg. So you pop out of the prescription window and you start consuming these larger fuels until you have complete combustion of everything, which was, sort of an extreme fire event like you saw in parts of California. Clearly, there's different ecological implications to what happens in these kinds of fires, but right now we're stuck in that window, and what part of our work is we're going to try and expand that window. Last thing I'll talk about here is the sort of fundamentally different approaches in the two sciences that, we're arguing that this science needs to emerge as a separate discipline. We can plan our experiments, We're cross-disciplinary. We're looking at everything from ecology to sociology, physics to engineering. And our goal is to provide guidance on planning and management. Over here, you're looking at opportunistic data. Most of the research has been focused on fire spread because that's one of the most important pieces of information for safety. Where's the fire going? How fast is it going to get there? And the guidance is on how do you react? How do you apply your resources to try and suppress that fire? And some of it is applied towards rehabilitation post-fire, with the implication that fire is this destructive, damaging event. But it comes down to brass tacks. The real difference is if you're managing a wildfire, if you're on an incident and you're the incident commander of a wildfire, you didn't start that fire. You're not responsible for starting that fire. Your responsibility is making sure that as few people get injured, as little property is lost as possible. So all your decision making is geared through those lenses, and there isn't that weight of sort of cause. You didn't cause the fire. That's not on your shoulders. Now, a prescribed fire manager walks into a flammable landscape that is not on fire, makes a decision to ignite that landscape on fire, to achieve a resource management objective, and sometimes a safety objective in terms of reducing fuels. We argue that wouldn't you want to give that person the best possible science to maximize the success? Because that is a really, really, really weighty decision. And we're working towards that. The reason why we felt like we needed to define the discipline as well is that there's a lot of knowledge gaps. And we're not going to go through these, but suffice it to say that if you haven't investigated a concept very much, there's a lot of questions that remain to be answered. So what is it? It's not coming in after a fire and counting dead trees. That's how a lot of wildfire-centric science accomplishes their ecological research focus. They come in and they count dead trees. Our approach has been to exploit sort of the explosion in new technology and computer modeling and garbage in, garbage out, where we're able to collect really good empirical data on fire behavior, a bunch of aspects of how the fire burns itself, and then apply that empirical information to create some new models that I think are revolutionary, that I think you're going to be excited about. So we use things like thermal imagers, infrared cameras, and we've designed systems where we can deploy them in prescribed fires. This is a prescribed fire at Osceola National Forest that we did to study the influence of how energy release structures plant communities. And if we wouldn't have had this kind of data, we would have never been able to make some of these really important inferences on how fire actually supports the milk pea and the deltoid spurge and maintains biodiversity. This is new technology, but it's also very robust. And what we've been applying is surface LiDAR technology and aerial, airborne, and even satellite platforms for LiDAR, laser radar, light detection and ranging. We're able to capture the structure and composition of the vegetation in unbelievable detail. And this sort of revolution in data collection has allowed us to build some models that can actually work and actually capture fire behavior in a meaningful way. My colleague Louise Laudermilk has been a leader in developing this approach. So we're arguing that prescribed fire science actually represents a paradigm shift in the realm of understanding wildland fire. So wildland fire is both prescribed fire and wildfire, but we're saying, well, the way we were approaching the way we study fire is that it's mechanistic, it's integrated, and it's going to give us better predictions. And it represents a whole new way of thinking about fire. And always remember when you're changing paradigms to push the clutch. You'll grind the gears if you don't. So let's go back to those three elements that we argue make it a new paradigm: mechanistic understanding of fire, integrated approach, and making better predictions. And this is where it matters to you. For years, nobody understood why fire and plant community diversity were linked. So high fire frequency equals high plant diversity. We know that's true in pine rocklands. We know it's true in longleaf. We know it's true in a bunch of other ecosystems, grasslands. What we were able to do by mapping out the amount of energy that a fire releases and then tracking individual plant mortality, we were able to tie the two together to the structure of the forest. So this is that ecology of fuels combined with measurement, revolutionary, new measurement techniques. And we were able to answer a fundamental question that on how fire structures plant communities. And we'll get into that in a minute and how we can model that. Our approach is integrated. We understand that to understand how fire works, you need to understand the physics of fire. You need to understand the meteorology of fire. You need to understand the ecology of fuels. You also need to understand the ecology of fire effects. And this is sort of our conceptual model for a big multi-million-dollar project we got going on right now on mechanistic fire effects. How are we actually going to predict what fire does in a way that isn't going in after the fire counting dead trees? We're actually measuring the energy, understanding how that energy influences biological systems, combining it with information on forest structure and winds, and we'll be able to synthesize these multidisciplinary approaches into better predictive models. And that's what we're going to talk about right now. Let me see if this works. This is just a fun sort of sidebar here. The models that we're using are also they're not new. The concept of a agent-based modeling actually started in the 1950s, but it hadn't really exploded until the late 80s. And now Mike Ross actually had the foresight to apply a agent-based model to predict the impacts of sea level rise on Sugarloaf Key in the Florida Keys way back in the late 80s, early 90s. So Mike's a cutting-edge scientist. But these agent-based models, this is a little, I'm going to do a live. They're little rule-based models where you have what are called autonomous agents behaving based on 3 or 4 simple rules. This is rules based on rock, paper, scissors. So I don't know which one's rock, paper, scissors, but just imagine playing a game of rock, paper, scissors. Well, if you model it and using this agent-based modeling approach, you can get these really complex patterns and phenomena from really simple rules. And if those rules are based on science, you could actually have a very powerful tool for making good predictions of what something complex is doing. This is rock, paper, scissors, but this same kind of pattern approach could be used for predator, prey, parasitoid. It's amazing. It's an amazing tool. Let's get back to the show. So we've used this concept and this technology to predict how plant community assembly works with and without fire. We have a model that can do that pretty effectively based on neutral theory and this thing called the continuum hypothesis. But even more important, we've been able to apply this concept to fire behavior prediction. So right now we're left without a good fire behavior prediction model that's useful for prescribed fire. The current suite of models that wildfire scientists and managers use are either too computationally intense, so they're not available to the user, or they're based on fundamentally unrealistic assumptions. They don't give you the answers that you need. So we've developed a new model called QuickFire. It's based on a cellular automata that's informed by fluid dynamics. We won the R&D 100 award, one of the 100 best ideas of 2020 for this model, which we're very proud of. And we're starting to apply this to prescribed fire practitioners at the federal level, and we're looking to sort of broaden it to other users. So what does it do? It's a fluid dynamics model, CA model, cellular automata with fluid dynamics rules that will run on a laptop. Normally these fluid dynamics models take supercomputers, but we've been able to develop a system where we capture the most important rules and can run it on a laptop in faster than real time. So this is an example of a wildfire out in New Mexico that QuickFire was able to capture the fire behavior very accurately. It depends on some complex inputs, but garbage in, garbage out. So it is an operational tool right now. We can use it to help managers make decisions about ignition patterns. It's 3-dimensional, so it actually can predict how fire behavior will be influenced by different vegetation structure. It's a coupled fire atmosphere model, which is important. because it also can inform smoke lofting, and it's built off of realistic fuels. So the other thing it'll do is it'll predict smoke dispersion, so which is a primary concern for most prescribed fire managers. Where's their smoke going to go? Is it going to clog up a road and cause an accident and a fatality? Is it going to land on a hospital full of COVID patients? That kind of thing. So we're working to improve the tools that prescribed fire managers will need. And we're working in this framework where we have different levels of resolution and different kinds of models that are all meshing, and they're all designed to mesh with each other. So for example, we use Louise Laudermilk's 3-dimensional fuels to inform quickfire, which informs our 2-dimensional plant community dynamics model, which then reinforms the fuel. So we're approaching this thing called the grand unification model of prescribed fire, which sounds arrogant, but that's kind of half jokingly what we're calling it. So the foundation that I'm talking about is prescribed fire science, is developing a mechanistic understanding of fire and making it useful. And the way we make it useful is by identifying the critical drivers and then giving the users tools. So there it is. There's our grand unification model. And things that matter would be, how does forest structure influence fire? How do you light a fire to get your desired effects? And what happens when you lose your canopy or your canopy is damaged by a storm, say? How is that going to influence how you light your fire? And you can run scenarios and make decisions, informed decisions based on sort of a high-level model. So last thing I'll say, prescribed fire science will inform wildfire science because some of the fundamental processes are the same. This is a prescribed fire in Banff National Park. This is a wildfire in North Georgia. So don't let your preconceived notions on how fires behave and how they're labeled like blind you to the reality that some of the information that we're going to collect will be useful for both fields. Last thing that's I'm going to talk about here is we're going to create an advanced forest technology hub, not a hump, a hub at the Athens Fire Lab. And so the way we're looking at it is these models are somewhat tricky to parameterize, meaning you have to tweak the model with the right inputs to make it work. Rather than trying to train people to do it themselves, we would act sort of like a spot forecast request. So if you're familiar with spot forecasts, you can, if you're a fire manager, you can basically contact the National Weather Service, say, I'm planning a prescribed fire here tomorrow, what's my weather forecast? And the forecaster will actually do an individual personal forecast for you. We would do the same. We have an expert team assembled, and that we would consult with the manager. Like, we'd obviously have to figure out how to make this happen, but tune our models to answer the questions that they're interested in. And questions relating to parameters like weather parameters, how do you light it, burn unit by weather interactions, what burn unit do you burn on what day, what are your desired outcomes, do you want to kill things, do you not want to kill things, that sort of thing. And the other really cool thing in terms of training is that we've got virtual reality and artificial intelligence working on using these models to create a virtual environment for training purposes, where you're actually immersed in the fire. You can walk into the fire. You can light the fire in different ways. This is an actual screenshot of one of our prototype artificial intelligence and virtual reality models of a prescribed fire in Longleaf. So the last thing I think they asked us to talk about was, what is the future of pine rocklands? Well, I'm going to remind everybody that if you're not burning your pine rocklands, they don't have a future. And I can't stress that enough. You have to burn them. Now, there's a lot of challenges that are, that we're seeing, and why they're not being burned, or maybe they're not being burned enough, but we can start to address these challenges and find solutions to the challenges through the lens of the ecology of fuels. So for example, sea level rise, if you're losing your pines, you're in trouble. If you're losing them because of sea level rise and they're gone permanently, well, you've got to come up with a plan B. In terms of hurricane damage, the loss of overstory pines has a profound effect on the fire dynamics. We need to understand what our approach should be to deal with the loss of a temporary loss of a canopy from a disturbance like a hurricane or a pathogen like we saw in the Turks and Caicos. I would argue that the Bahamas, the prognosis is good, even with the storm damage that we saw from Chris Russell. I think that with an appropriate fire management regime, we're going to get excellent regeneration, and that forest will be good as it was in 25, 30 years. South Florida obviously is mixed with sea level rise in the background. It's the elephant in the room. And the other thing that is a real problem is the lack of fire in these little urban rockland fragments. That to me is an easily solvable problem. Turks and Caicos, again, sea level rise and the sort of endemic plague of insects. It's going to be tough. Why do I think that Ron Eman Park is easy to burn? We know that it's easy to burn in the Bahamas. This is the southern tip of Abaco, probably the easiest place in the world to burn. All we need to do there is maybe tweak the prescription so we don't eat up coppice or hammock. But why do I think it should be one of the easiest things in the world to burn Ron Eman? It's a tiny parcel surrounded by concrete, so you don't have to worry about escapes. Yeah, maybe you might have some hostile neighbors right here, but it would be probably fairly easy to loft what little smoke you would get from this, exploiting the sort of predictable patterns of wind in South Florida. So A, the amount of smoke that you would produce from this fragment is minuscule. B, you don't have any containment issues. So I would argue somebody's got to grab the reins and say, we're going to start burning these little fragments. So what if the neighbors complain? We can do it safely, but it has to happen. Otherwise, you're going to lose it. You've lost the fundamental process that structures it. So the last thing, I'm here to help you. So I've been forced into some mandatory training this week because I was promoted to project leader. But what that means is, because I love South Florida and I love Pine Rocklands, I'm going to switch our focus to helping you get your stuff burned. And this includes the Everglades and the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos as much as I can. And this fire lab is at your disposal. You can consult us anytime, and if you have a question regarding fire. And I would also encourage you to participate in the consortium in an active way. I've made contact with some folks in the Audubon Society over at Corkscrew. They have an awesome fire program over there, but we're trying to develop this would be the first time we sort of worked with a quote unquote private landowner, a non-governmental landowner, in developing building the foundation to allow us to use quick fire at Corkscrew. But we'd like to do the same at the Everglades as well, and maybe Ron Eman, who knows. And that's all I have. I don't know. I hope I didn't go too long. I'm going to stop sharing. I think we got a little bit of time for some questions, right?
Yeah. And thanks, Joe. You're a rock star you're the rock star of this presentation. You've got over 80 people in here that want to hear from you. So
yeah, everybody loves fire, right?
Yeah. I'll read you a couple of things from the chat, and then okay. And have people just unmute themselves and ask questions to you. Oh, I have to say first that we couldn't see the rock, paper, scissors thing.
Bummer.
And okay. I was about to interrupt you, and then you went on to the next slide. So sorry I didn't say anything.
It's just really cool. You can, it just shows how cellular automatas work. So it's fun. It's nothing really informative.
Okay, then we won't make you do it again and reshare. So Dallas Hazelton says, would you go so far as to say that for the natural area, any fire is good, wild or prescribed? In other words, is wildfires just a problem for humans, not the habitat?
Yeah. Like, fire doesn't care who lit it, right? I mean, it's a physical process that's doing something, and our interpretation of what it's doing is good or bad. So I agree with you, Dallas. And that slide where I showed the raging crown fire, which was a prescribed fire, and then the little skunking backing fire was a wildfire. So the terms are relevant to who lit it and what their intent was, and potentially what the effects are. So undesirable effects are typically associated with a wildfire, but not always. So a wildfire just really refers to, was it intended or was it accidental or malicious? So yeah, it's a human value, not a physical fire value.
All right. Jimmy Lang wants to ask, are there laws that protect public employees like burn bosses from private lawsuits? And if so, maybe that would encourage more proactive approaches.
Yeah, there is. There is mostly in the southern states. So Florida has a prescribed prescribed burner protection law, liability protection law. Florida has got the sort of highest bar to get sort of liability protection. You have to take a lot of you have to be highly trained in Florida. If you work for a public agency, you're protected by sovereign immunity to a certain extent, unless there's been gross negligence. So, gross negligence is criminal. Nuisance liability is not, and you're usually protected from nuisance liability, which means that you didn't do anything wrong, but something bad happened. And so there are plenty of laws that if you follow the rules and you get your burn permit and something bad happens, you're protected. Now, if you don't get your burn permit or you light a fire when you were told not to and it escapes, then you're in trouble. But yes, there's a good deal of protection in Florida and Georgia, South Carolina, sort of the southeastern tier of states for prescribed burners, because they recognize how important it is.
Luis Moreno wants to know, how do you become a burn boss?
Okay, that's a long road to hoe. If you're talking about an NWCG, sort of like a federal burn boss, RXB2, you have to work your way up the ranks, starting as a firefighter, becoming what's called a single resource, like a engine captain, crew boss, and then you become an incident commander, type 4. Then you become a firing boss, and then you have to get training for RXB2. So it would probably take your beginning firefighter about 10 years to get through that process to become an RXB2. Now, when you're an RXB2, that's a pretty important job. You're generally you're lighting thousands of acres as an RXB2. So, you're a highly qualified, highly trained individual. That said, a private, an individual who decides to burn their back 40 can get enough experience to do it safely in a relatively short period of time with these training programs that Florida and Georgia, for example, have certified prescribed burners. But for federal and state, the complexity issue, you might be burning in large areas next to, like Everglades National Park. You need a RXB2 to manage that program, or even a type 1, which is even more highly qualified. So if you're really interested in it, and you're a firefighter already, you just tell your supervisor that I want to be a burn boss, and they will start you on that trajectory.
Okay, let's move to audience questions, and I'm going to call on Janet Gill first. Janet has a question. Go ahead.
Thanks, Joe. And it's not really a question. It's more like bear with me, a little bit of a back and forth. I don't know if you saw my talk. We've met in the past, but I'm the EO program director.
Okay.
So I can't speak for the entire county part, because there are preserves that are in county ownership, but not through the EO program and not managed through us, even though we are now in charge of managing most of them. So I became the director in around 2015 officially. And since then, fire, because I have Joy Klein in my ear all the time, fire just became a very real thing. And because of dwindling funds and our issues, I was like, that's it. Fire is cheap. It's effective. Everything else I do in Pine Rockland costs me the most amount of money. We just need to burn. It was like a no-brainer. So I made it a priority, and I have sort of a very bullish personality where I said, it just don't want any excuses. It just has to happen. So we took steps in that direction. Joy mentioned in the chat, first, we requested and we got a second burn boss. The training was fully paid by EO and everything, and we're getting a third burn boss certified.
Great.
There was a lot of dialogue with Dallas, which are been our burn boss for a very long time, but, you know, about how could we rethink what we're doing, you know, what's inhibiting us, you know,
Right.
and so we've kind of taken that and applied it to just, you know, and then one of the basic things we did was change our messaging, Joe, which was, you know, we were scared as a county and we were being reactive and we were in our own prison. And then it got to the point where it was like, I said, no, everybody just needs to understand it's going to burn.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of when and if we want to control our destiny, you know? And we had Rockdale. I don't know if you're familiar with it and you remember it. It's one of our key sites. It sits on US 1. And I happen to have been just on the cusp of becoming a director when we had this fire that was on the news, you know, in Rockdale next to US 1 with these flames and things were shooting into, you know, and then I happened to have an arsonist start to put fires in Larry and Penny at the same time. So it was like fire was becoming very relevant to the EO program. And I just said, you know, I don't want any more scares. I want to own this, you know, and we haven't. And I want to give a shout out to Rodell, the one Rodell Collins he managed to burn a site next to an airport, next to a school, right by a hospital. Yep. You know, I was like, you can't get any more like, don't do it. And we did it and we've done it again. So we are involved in this, but so now I'm going to end. I'm going to say, but we need the help of folks like you guys that have,
and I would say call us anytime.
Yeah. You know, because having not just a voice from within, but from outside that speaks of the science, that supports the program, that explains this messaging, it's really, you know, sometimes our management doesn't listen to us just because we're in the organization. So.
Yeah, happy to help. And I think the consortium could be a real valuable tool as well. I think you should join the consortium and think about just even, you know, whether you show up or not, or who knows what's going to happen in the spring. But it's a resource that connects you with both scientists and managers that can help you. And, you know, once we get our feet under ourselves after, you know, whatever happens with COVID, I really want to bring a team down to South Florida with the LiDAR, maybe develop some fuel models and do some quick fire runs to show how, you know, to show how you can loft the smoke in that situation. You know, Rodell probably just had to figure it out, right?
Yeah.
You don't have any good tools to help him decide whether it was a good burn day or not. And that's that's the tragedy right there. And like, if it went the wrong way, it would have shut you down. But because he's experienced and he has good senses, you know, it went well. But the problem is when things change and fuels change and the heating of the concrete around you causes, you know, wind changes, things like that. We can actually model that now and help make better decisions. So
yeah, we were definitely being opportunistic.
Yeah,
is the way I want to treat it. Rodell was just, you know, this site's got fire breaks that we recently put in. You know, it hasn't had a burn. Let's just do it. You know,
I missed your talk. I apologize because I'm in mandatory training right now because I just got promoted to the project leader and was unfortunate, but I didn't mean to pick on Ron Eman, but you know, for a long time there was.
Well, that one's not mine. That one's not mine.
Well, yeah, I'm just, you know, what I like to tell people when I'm talking about South Florida is that if, you know, it's kind of like the worst case scenario. You know, you've got these little fragments of really highly diverse, a lot of endangered species embedded in basically what looks like a circuit board of human development. And if you can do it, California can do it. You know, where the situation is different, the fuels are different, but you know, I really feel like South Florida, the fact, you know, you're saddled with probably one of the most critical fire dependent ecosystems in terms of conservation value and the most difficult conditions to burn. I was being facetious when I said it was easy to burn, but in many, like, you don't have to worry about an escape. That's one thing you really don't have to worry about. It's not going to burn across the street. A pavement makes a really good fire break, and generally they're small, so we should be able to get it done. And it's going to be critical to support all the things that fire does. So kudos to you for getting it done.
Well, it's not me. I'm not the one that has to, yeah, I'm not the one sweating,
Right.
It's Rodell. And so I'm going to share Jose Prieto. I don't know if you've met him also. He's the other one that's looking to get certified. So what I'm going to do is share this talk with them and, hopefully begin the dialogue with them and you guys. And I just want to say that, there's been studies done by Jennifer Posley on this call and everything, and the fact that in the past that just supports, doing other management things as a band-aid is just not the same. Using fire as a surrogate just doesn't work here. So
no, I mean, it doesn't work anywhere. Like that term fire surrogate is it's nothing.
It's terrible.
There's fire mojo. Fire has mojo, and it does a lot of things simultaneously that any individual action doesn't. So
I'm sorry I took up a lot of time from other folks, so I'm just going to be quiet now. But I really thought it was important to reconnect.
Yeah, absolutely, and either go direct with me, or if you don't, I don't know if my contact information is easily available, but I really am. I consider South Florida my second home. I love it down there. I love the ecosystems. That's where I basically learned how to be a scientist down there. And I feel some kind of connection that I'd like to strengthen. So can't wait to get back down when I can travel.
Thank you. And if you get a chance, look at our talk. I didn't go over.
Yes.
I didn't go over fire, but that's because I didn't have updated numbers, and I figured there's going to be 2 fire talks, so I'll leave it to the experts.
Yeah.
Joe, a lot of people in the chat are great talk. Mackie had a question, and that was, Mackie, do you want to just ask it since you're there about joining the Fire Consortium?
Sure. I was just wondering, when you suggested to join the Fire Consortium, I was wondering if that's a professional membership or that's an informal thing, or if that's institutional, or how that works.
It's It's
sorry.
It's quasi formal. It's informal. It's there are no requirements to join. It's meant just to be an atmosphere where people who use fire and people who study fire rub shoulders and share ideas and knowledge. So it's very much a now in terms of hosting people on the burn, we have to we got to regulate that somehow, but in general, it's pretty wide open. And like I said, we've been hamstrung by COVID, and that's kind of like, we feel like we're losing momentum. We had really good momentum. We had done 2 of these burn events, but now obviously it's almost impossible. So, but yes, join, Naki. I already consider you a member. And Chris Russell, and everybody from the Bahamas. So yeah, everybody, you're all welcome. Everybody on this talk, you're all members of the consortium.
Have any other questions for Joe from the audience? If you're shy, you can put it in the chat.
Hey, it's Flash. How's it going?
Flash and Naki, how is the bird you're rehabbing?
Well, she ventured in again a minute ago. I hope she didn't appear on camera, but she needs to go at the end of this week. Thank you.
All right. I think we can pull the plug and Joe, let you go back to your your training.
Yeah, thank God these talks are recorded. I am going to check them out, but I do have to go back to my my psychological training for leadership. So I really appreciate everybody paying attention and joining. I wish we could have done this together in gone and had some beers, but next year, year after next, that'll be when we're in the Turks and Caicos in Bahamas. That's what, yeah, we'll have those field trips for real this time. So, all right.
Come back for the happy hour next Friday at 4.
I will be here. Yeah,
Okay.
I will be there in my basement. Yeah.
All right.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
I'd love to give shout outs to everybody, but it'd take too long. Great seeing everybody. Ciao.
Ciao.
Bye.
Congratulations.